to not even know many people who had to go to Vietnam, and in our families or friends from school or anything, and also not to know anyone who ever ended up in the infantry who would be fighting the war. And I never even knew of anybody personally who died in the war. So I was very fortunate to be insulated from the war in that respect. I never had.
Your friend Harold, was his accident a result of that war?
No. Harold just was nothing more than an explosion at the National Guard Armory of gas leaking into the building. No, he was in the reserves, and back then, and that was probably during when the war was going on, but their reserve unit was never called to go overseas. But no, I was fairly much insulated from, the tragedy of the war, because I never knew anybody that had real game in it.
How was the leadership of the country or the military during this time?
Well, as far as the military goes, you don't remember too many generals after Douglas MacArthur, and that was 10 years. That was 10 years before the Vietnam War, because he had such a row or a fight with President Truman, and he was a very popular general. But after that, I couldn't tell you the names of any generals, even generals that would be at the top of my organization when I was at Fort Benning in Georgia. But I think we probably had a very well organized Pentagon with all branches of service, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. As far as the leadership, governmental leadership, the president, whomever he was at the time, starting with John F. Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson, and then even Richard Nixon, for the most of their terms, they had pretty well the support of the populace, and they certainly had the full support of their charges, because they were commander in chief. So I think probably it all started falling apart somewhere around 1970, when the protests really kicked off. Kent State was a huge protest where the National Guard shot 4 students. And that was, only 4 students, but yet that was a very momentous turning point for people's opinions of military versus the expression, free expression of the American public. And that's probably when people started really questioning more whether we were winning, whether we were doing the right thing by prolonging. And that's when the whole movement started protesting, and some of the troop withdrawals and all started, because I really think they were out of there by late 72, or certainly summer of 73. It was why Nixon was still president, and he resigned in 74.
In what ways, either short-term or long-term, do you think the war affected the United States? Either through society, government, or military?
Well, I think it probably caused the public to be a bit more skeptical about going to wars since then. Reagan even invaded Grenada, or Grenada, if you want to say that. And how strategic would Grenada be except you couldn't get nutmeg because that's all they did down there was grow nutmeg. But Reagan invaded Grenada for whatever reason. But that at least that probably lasted a few weeks, and we didn't have too many more conflicts like that with countries abroad, I guess, until we got so involved in the Middle East. And I think that more people were skeptical from the beginning, even though we've been in either, whether it was Kuwait or because that was around 1991, and then from Kuwait right into Iraq. And so we've been in that war for 15. Oh yeah, Desert Storm started it from Kuwait. Of course, we did liberate Kuwait, but because Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, but we liberated Kuwait. But we've been fighting in Iraq for over 14 years now. I think that there's probably a much greater percent of the populace who are skeptical about either whether we know what we're doing or whether we had the plan, whether it's an enemy we could defeat or just chase from one country to another. So I really think that people are more skeptical about these wars, certainly after the way the Vietnam conflict ended.
In what ways do you think it affected the world, either short term or long term?
Well, if you think about Vietnam itself, even though it's probably a communist regime, it's now a very popular tourist destination for Americans as well as others. The whole peninsula there with Myanmar, which I guess that was Burma, and Cambodia, and those countries which were all involved in the Vietnam conflict. Now we go there and we get along with the regimes and we get along with the people and everything. So the bad memories have sort of dissipated of the Vietnam conflict. So I wouldn't say that and maybe we've tried to downplay or rationalize the fact that it's probably the first war that America ever really lost. So, so maybe we've just put it in the back of our minds and haven't dwelled on it. So I don't know that Vietnam probably has had nearly the same effect as maybe what we're doing right now in the Middle East, because I mean we're fighting in Yemen, we're in Somalia, we're in Iraq and Syria and all that, and we're probably turning a huge population, which I think is the second largest religion in the world. We're leaving a bad taste in many mouths because of what we do. When I just read in the paper yesterday that the bombing in Mosul killed like 400 civilians. So that's a very hard war to fight there, because they're almost like the Viet Cong. You can't look at them and know who's the enemy or your friend, and they're putting themselves in the middle of civilian populations. So I think we're doing a lot more damage right now going forward with the way we're trying to administer fighting, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or some of the other names, Boko Haram, and all these names you hear about the different militant Muslim organizations. I think we're doing a lot more damage right now that might impact us more than the impact we felt worldwide once we we ever exited Vietnam.
Do you think if we stayed and kept on fighting, do you think we would win the war?
In Vietnam?
Yes.
No.
No?
No, absolutely not. No, we were not very effective there.
Mm-hmm.
It was gradual, but it was happening. And by the time they surround your capital city and you have to evacuate your embassy in helicopters,
Mm-hmm.
and that even became that you could see that on Broadway in Miss Saigon, because that was a very effective prop where the helicopter comes down from to the stage and they're on the top of the embassy and crawling up ladders to get out of Saigon. No, there's no way we could have won that war.
Those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you, and appreciate the opportunity. I hope I haven't sounded like the biggest buffoon in the world, but it's my take on it. So there you go.
Thank you.